Welcome to another edition of Analytics Lab, and my name is Chitong. I'm the CEO and co-founder of EngageRocket. Today we're going to be going through how do you design a great employee survey. Now, we all run employee surveys for all kinds of reasons in our company to measure how your employees tick, what makes them tick, what makes them sick, and all kinds of other things like tracking effectiveness of training, onboarding after an employee joins your company. How do you get them up to speed quickly and find out what their main pain points are? For people who leave the company, what are some of the key challenges that made them finally make that decision to leave? 360 performance reviews, all kinds of purposes. And one of the biggest challenges around employee surveys is that how do you know what questions to ask? And how do you analyze the results that you get? These are two big problems that cause companies to turn to consultants or to experts to help them. And of course, you should still continue to do that if there are high stakes involved. However, if you're running your own surveys in the next couple of months, here are some tips that you can use to make that a huge success for you and your team. I'm going to be sharing my screen shortly. And so over the next 35 to 40 minutes, we're going to be going through step by step. How do you go about designing a great employee survey? Please do write your questions in the comments. We'll be addressing them right at the end. And if you have anything that you want to ask specifically around EngageRocket, also please feel free to do so. We'll be happy to address those. EngageRocket is a company whose mission is to build better workplaces using people analytics. To date, we have worked with more than 30,000 users across 13 markets in 20 different industries, analyzing upwards of 500,000 responses. And we've been featured in quite a number of different outlets. We've been had the privilege of getting quite a lot of press written about us, mainly because of how much this mission has resonated with the public. We spend more than half our waking lives at work, and it would be great if leaders and bosses everywhere were using data to help improve our lives at work. And I'm Chitong, I'm co-founder and CEO. And I formerly, before joining EngageRocket, together with my co-founder Dorothy, we were the regional leadership team of Gallup, the American research and consulting company, having run more than 10 million survey responses across the Asia-Pacific region. And with all of that data and experience and insight, we've distilled some of the key learnings into these few principles that I'm going to be going through very shortly. So how do you design great employee surveys? There are 4 steps to it, and we call this a DART process, D-A-R-T process. D starts with defining or refining the outcome. Why this is really important is because sometimes it's very tempting to dive straight into running employee surveys with a very vague idea of what it is that we want to get out of them. But if we take the time to define these outcomes well, we're setting ourselves up for success. The A in DART is articulating the questions. So once we've defined the outcome, we are then in a better position to be able to articulate what questions it is that we want to ask. We're going to be going into a lot of detail into what kind of questions are good to ask and what we should try to avoid. The R would be then running the analytics. Once we get the data back, we need to make sense of it. It's not just a simple exercise of giving a data dump to the senior management team. We want to give them good stories and clear action points that they can then take targeted action on. And ideally, once you've completed a cycle of targeted action, you want to refine the outcome of these surveys and continue to track and monitor how you're doing over time. So we're going to start with defining or refining the outcome. So how do we do this well? The first thing that needs to happen once you find out what it is that you actually want to do. So for example, this could be how I want to know what my people are thinking. And I want to, or I want to know what people think of this particular person or this particular leader. Being able to go beyond that and actually put a hypothesis together. What do you think is true about the situation? For example, if you started out with, I want to find out more about what people think about Strange Fruit Corporation, you want to be able to boil that down into something that's tangible. And you can start anywhere. It doesn't really matter if you're right or wrong at this stage. But as long as you're specific, that's the most important part. So a bad hypothesis would look like this, for example. What do new joiners think about working at Strange Fruit Corp? And why is this bad? It's bad because it's too open-ended. There's no clear answer behind it. There's no real working theory behind what it is that you're looking for. So you might end up having survey results that go all over the place. Instead, a better hypothesis might be a statement like this. People leave Strange Fruit Corp in the first 90 days if they are not successfully engaged by their hiring manager. So with a hypothesis like this, it's much easier to focus your questions and the survey around this specific theory to prove or disprove what you're hypothesizing. So here are some elements of a good hypothesis. Number one, the hypothesis is not the research question. Remember, the research question is what do people think in the first 90 days after joining Strange Fruit? The hypothesis is a refinement of the research question. Secondly, it's a statement. It is typically not a question. The reason it is a statement is because you want to be able to say yes or no to this, ideally. Now, you want clear language that has very clearly identified variables that need testing. So in this case, we are clearly focusing on people who leave Strange Fruit. We are clearly also focusing on people who leave Strange Fruit in the first 90 days after hiring. We are also focusing on their levels of engagement and specifically their relationship with their hiring manager. So why this is important is that this makes the hypothesis extremely testable. So this is number 4. Once you can give a response to this hypothesis, whether it is validated or invalidated, you then have good actionable data with which to take further follow-up action. The next thing that the hypothesis will allow you to do is to decide on 2 things. The sample, so who is it that actually is going to be answering these surveys, and the periodicity. Should this be a one-off survey? Should this be something that happens every month, every week, every quarter, every half year, or even annually? So only with a very good hypothesis will you be able to identify these or have answers to these 2 elements very, very easily. One of the other things to consider is that every single question, every survey that you run sends a signal to the employee base. So this signal may be positive or negative depending on what it is that goes into that survey. Essentially, it tells employees who take the survey what management is prioritizing, what they care about, and ultimately what they're willing to take action on. So because of this, you want to be careful about opening cans of worms that you might not want to deal with just yet. So you want to focus the survey very, very specifically on as narrow a hypothesis as possible. So once you've defined and refined the outcome, the next thing to do is to start articulating the questions. So here are a few general categories of questions that you might want to consider picking from. So you have to be clear whether the questions you're asking are going to be objective questions or subjective questions. So objective questions are about truth. So for example, I've attended a company town hall in the last 6 months. Yes or no? It's very clear this is a true or false question. You can't half attend a company town hall or sort of attend a company town hall. You either had or you hadn't. However, there are also questions that are valuable, that are subjective. And these are questions like, I trust my direct manager, and they typically have a response scale that would look like this, between strongly agree and strongly disagree. Now, the big difference here is that it's very easy to confuse what a survey can give you in terms of the truth or falsehood of an answer. For objective questions, it is possible for the survey respondent to lie. So if I had attended a company town hall, but I say, no, I did not, then there's no way to verify yes or no, except hopefully over the law of large numbers, you'll be able to weed out the small percentage of liars to that survey. However, when you're asking subjective questions, it's very difficult to determine if somebody is telling the truth or not. In fact, as a best practice within survey research, you have to assume that whatever self-reported answer that is given is an accurate reflection of what's going on in the psychology of that respondent. The reason we say this is because we typically get this question: how do you know if the survey results are true or not? And if your survey is comprised entirely of subjective questions, there is no real way to verify this, even with expensive fMRI tests and blood tests given to respondents. Whatever they say pretty much is whatever we have to take it for granted that they believe. Now, you can always apply statistics and post validation using objective metrics to validate against their answers. But for the purposes of the survey, we have to go with whatever it is that we get. The second type of different type of question that you could ask would be benchmark questions or customized questions. So in some cases, you might come across questions that have been asked across a large number of different respondents. For example, how likely are you to recommend Strange Fruit as a place to work to your friends and family? Now, this is the Employee Net Promoter Score question, and it has been asked across multiple different industries and companies around the world. So if you can get your hands on a benchmark, you'll be able to compare results from your company to what other companies have responded to for this specific question. The trick behind this is that that particular question needs to be asked and phrased exactly as has been phrased in other companies and across different surveys. And you have to ensure that the response scale is the same. So for companies like EngageRocket, where we do ask some of these questions across all of our customers, you can have some guarantee that there is a solid benchmark behind it. But if you're Googling for benchmarks, this may not always be the best way to get benchmarks of specific questions. Now, the second type of questions would be customized questions. So these are questions that are specific to your company's situation that you want to ask. And you might want to ask, for example, about how this person deals with their team and whether or not they share expertise to help their immediate team. Now, you might not like the word expertise, and you might want to change it to shares their knowledge to help their immediate team. And you can go ahead and do that. The only caveat is that this then makes it a customized question instead of a benchmark question. And there are trade-offs both ways, And generally, we find that for repeating surveys, so pulse surveys, performance review type surveys that you're doing every 6 months, you'd rather tend more towards customized questions than benchmark questions, because the internal benchmarks and the internal relevance of those questions would be more important to you. However, if you're going for broad, high-level indicators that you might do on a one-off survey, like if you were to run Employee Net Promoter Score in a dipstick that you do once every 3 years, then the benchmark might be a little bit more relevant for you. So the different question types that you would have available would depend on the different purposes of what you're trying to find out. So Likert scale questions, you come across this quite often, are questions that run from typically 1 to 5 or 0 to 10, and there are normally scale anchors at the endpoint. So strongly disagree to strongly agree. Those kind of questions would be Likert scale questions, and you want to apply the Likert scales normally to subjective questions where you're trying to understand sentiment and extremities of sentiment better. Multiple choice questions would be a question like, which of the following do you think was the most important in your decision to join Strange Fruit? Company brand, sign-on bonus, awesome culture, or others? And then the respondent would choose one or more of these items. So obviously the reason for multiple choice is you have clear items to choose from, and you want to see what the respondents respond to the most. Yes or no questions are quite self-explanatory. I have had a developmental conversation with my boss in the past 3 months, yes or no. These tend to be used more for the objective questions to allow for analyses that would be cut by all respondents who said yes versus all respondents who said no to this particular item. The next type of questions would be the open-ended questions. So open-ended questions is when you want more qualitative information from the survey respondent. For example, if you could change one thing about the culture at Strange Fruit, what would it be? And finally, would be demographic questions. So these would be questions that help to identify the demographics of the respondents. For example, please click on the department you work for. Now, if you're using freely available survey software to run your surveys, you might need to ask these questions in order to get good demographic segmentation of your results when they come out. Or if you're using software like EngageRocket, you don't have to ask any of these. These are all coded on the back end, and you can save shorten the length of your surveys by cutting all of these out. So here are some things to avoid when phrasing and asking your questions. There's 6 horsemen of the question apocalypse. The first one would be loaded questions. So loaded questions are like leading questions. For example, do you agree that there are more people leaving Strange Fruit because of the recent salary revision exercise? By asking a question like this, you are priming the respondent to link the fact that people are leaving Strange Fruit to the recent salary revision exercise. And it may not be a valid connection. The second of these 6 horsemen would be double-barreled questions. The double-barreled questions are when you ask a question about 2 separate things where a response doesn't actually tell you much about either. For example, I am satisfied with the coaching and training opportunities at Strange Fruit. Now, this looks like an innocent enough question, but for somebody who says, I strongly agree with this question, are they saying that they strongly agree that they are satisfied with the coaching opportunities at Strange Fruit, or the training opportunities at Strange Fruit, or the coaching and training opportunities at Strange Fruit? There's no way to tell, and so you're left with action that might have to be done on both of these elements that have been included in the question. The third question, horseman to avoid, is the biased question. So this question could be, for example, do you think that Mr. CEO has been doing a wonderful job at Strange Fruit in the past quarter? The word wonderful connotates that Mr. CEO has indeed done a wonderful job and positively primes the response of the respondent. Now, to correct for that, we might change the question to be something like, overall, how satisfied are you with Mr. CEO's performance at Strange Fruit in the past quarter? Fourth are the assumptive questions. So assumptive questions are a turn-off to respondents who the questions do not relate to. So if you're asking to a general audience, for example, do you think that the maternity leave benefit is sufficient? For someone who actually wouldn't qualify for maternity leave, I'd be wondering, is this survey intended for me or not, or should I answer this question? And it might affect your completion rates on your survey if people decide, it looks like this survey wasn't meant for me, I'm going to drop off. Next are questions that assume second-hand knowledge from the respondent. So what this means is that you're assuming that the respondent knows about certain things, and you're asking questions with that assumption. For example, is our company culture the right one for our current business environment? So a question like this assumes many things of the respondent. It assumes that the respondent is aware of the current business environment and that they have an accurate assessment of that environment. So the responses that you would get from such a question cannot really be trusted. You have no idea whether or not it is due to the fact that the business environment was poorly assessed by the respondent base, or whether the company culture is indeed the wrong one for the business environment. Finally, the last question to avoid would be hypothetical questions. So these hypothetical questions ask questions of the respondent about what they would do if something that hasn't happened yet were to happen. For example, would you be more likely to stay at Strange Fruit if we split the annual bonus into quarterly payouts? Now, the reason you would want to avoid such questions is because there's no way to know whether this person is going to act in the way that they have answered. And so by taking action on their responses, you're hoping that what they say is going to be what they do, which in many, many cases turns out not to be true. The last thing, once you've avoided all of these 6 horsemen of the questionnaire apocalypse, is to avoid garbage in, garbage out. So garbage in, garbage out is a phrase that was originally used in data analytics to say that if your data inputs are garbage, the only output that you can expect is also garbage. So ways to avoid the fact that avoid feeding garbage into the survey machine would be number 1. For surveys that do require anonymity or confidentiality, you'd want to ensure that this is true as far as you can. So, for example, if you're asking employee feedback on management and there is concerns that people might get marked or there might be some reprisals from management if people were to give truthful answers, then we need to find a way to ensure that their responses are anonymous. So either by reducing the number of demographic questions that are asked, or that the responses are confidential, typically by using a third-party provider like EngageRocket. Second item here is to make sure that the questions are kept simple. So, of course, many of you know KISS stands for Keep It Simple, Stupid. It's really to ensure that every single person is able to understand the question and to interpret the questions in the same way. So you wouldn't want to be asking overly complex questions that are open to multiple different types of interpretations across the organization. The third thing to avoid would be recency bias. So you don't want to be asked questions about, well, I mean, you don't want to ask questions about the bonus of a company and whether or not it was sufficient right after they've received an abnormally large bonus, for example. So you might get a lot of people saying yes, but that might be because they most recently remembered the large bonus that they've gotten. And while it might be comforting to think that that's a good score, over time you'd find that people act differently than what you would expect from that particular survey. The fourth item would be the social desirability bias. So asking questions around just being conscious that people would respond to survey questions, even if they are anonymous or confidential, in a way that they would like to be portrayed socially. So if you were to ask about integrity at work and whether or not the respondent felt that they had integrity, you tend to find that they would answer very positively as opposed to truthfully. And then finally, the last thing to be concerned about would be framing effects. For example, it was found in one of the surveys that we've done in the past, which did political polling, and we found that by having questions about politics right before questions about happiness and well-being, this tended to depress how happy people reported that they were during the happiness questions, as opposed to if the politics questions were to come after the happiness questions. So the way that the questionnaire is structured could potentially frame how the respondent replies to each of the different questions. So with all of that, that's a lot around articulating the questions. Then once you've gotten the responses in, you need to think about, what do we make of all the data? How do we run the analytics behind what we've received? So obviously, the topic of analytics is too large for us to cover in a short webinar like this, but we'll cover some basics that could help you get started. Back to the slide around what is my hypothesis. When you start the analytics, the easiest thing to do and the most relevant thing to do is to go back to your hypothesis and figure out, was this true or not? So once you've done that, you can actually start, there are some common ways in which to slice and dice the data. So you would, for example, look for positive trends or negative trends, or in some cases even certain anomalies for the surveys that you're doing regularly. What are some of the unusual changes in the data that you're seeing from this particular cycle? So you can do this quite quickly using an Excel spreadsheet, or if you want it to be done in real time for you, platforms like EngageRocket would be able to help. The next thing to do that is commonly done is to look at segmentation. So being able to identify how different employee segments have responded to the different items that you've asked is really critical to identify like where it is that you need to exert intervention effort. So the general averages for the whole company are not going to be able to do much in terms of actionability. But once you get extremely granular about where your challenges are and what those challenges are exactly, you can test these against the hypothesis that you started out with and very quickly narrow down where it is that you should be taking action and where you should be investing management effort and attention on. And then finally, natural language processing. A simple version would be running word clouds on open-ended responses. So There are many free word cloud software that's available online, which you can dump all of the verbatim responses into those to see if there are any commonly used words. If you're looking for slightly more sophisticated natural language processing, like sentiment analysis or topic analysis, these might be done with certain platforms. Like you can use EngageRocket or any other of some of these providers. And these would help you, for example, classify whether each of these responses are positive, negative, or neutral, or which type of driver of engagement would they fall under, to be able to give you a good sense of what are some of the common themes that people are talking about. Of course, you can always read through all the responses yourself. For example, if you have less than 100 open-ended responses, it makes good sense to use a human eye to read through all of them and to classify them accordingly. Finally, you'd want to be looking at things that make a difference to objective business metrics, like, for example, talent attrition. So in this example, what you're seeing is the engagement score over time of a company that did pulse surveys, tracked on a monthly basis, correlated against the attrition of that company over time as well on a month-to-month basis. So very clearly from this correlation analysis, you'll be able to see that as the engagement score of, as the engagement of this particular company fell, the attrition rate and the rate at which they were losing their talent also increased. And this was, in this particular case, it was shown to be at a 79% Pearson's R. So you want to be able to do these correlation analyses to be able to identify what are some of the things that actually matter in the surveys that we're asking to the business. Now, finally, after doing all of this work, you can finally get down to taking targeted action. Now, this is going to differ depending on the nature of the survey you're running and the type of hypothesis that you've set up. But this would normally involve a certain amount of buy-in from managers, from business unit heads, and so on. And the great thing is, if you've been able to follow the steps through DAR and T, the buy-in process would not be difficult, because you'll have the hypothesis set up, you'll have the questions asked and the data to prove why it is that you need to take certain targeted action following the survey. Now, something that we get asked a lot at EngageRocket is, so how do you actually improve your participation rate? The average participation rate that we've seen across more than 30,000 respondents on EngageRocket's platform is 85 to 88%. And this is quite incredible to us. There's no incentives given. There's very little coercion that is given. But then how do you go about getting people to actually answer the surveys that you're asking? Because there's nothing worse than preparing everything and going to field with your surveys and coming back with a 10 or 20% response rate. So here are some best practices that we have encountered that we like to share, which you can use in your own surveys as well. The first of these would be communicating and following up on your survey. So obviously, even before you launch the survey, there should be some form of communication to all the respondents about why they're taking the survey and why it's important that you get their response. And most importantly, being able to frame for them what's in it for me. Why should I take this survey, take out 2 to 3 minutes of my day to give you my honest feedback? So this communication typically should come from as senior a level as possible. So if it's going to be a company-wide employee engagement survey, for example, this should come from the CEO or at the very least, the chief HR officer, to show and communicate the emphasis that the company is placing on how people feel engaged at work or not. Once that communication has gone out, you want to ensure that there are follow-ups and ways to close the loop. So while you're in the field, ensuring after the first invite email has gone out, you want to ensure that people who have not taken the surveys get reminders. It's very easy to miss the invitations in our busy inboxes. We get an average of 150 to 200 emails each every single day. So if this invitation came over email, it's possible that the respondent completely missed it. So this is where the reminders come in, and you can choose 2 or 3 reminders per survey, depending on how long the field period is and how important it is for you to get the data back from them. Ideally, you'd only send these reminders to people who have not taken the survey, so you don't end up spamming, especially senior management who might have already taken the survey and might be annoyed at getting reminders to take it. So some automated platforms would allow you to skip those who have already taken the surveys, like EngageRocket. Of course, communication and follow-up isn't just about the survey. Post-survey is extremely important for the results to be communicated to the necessary stakeholders. And in back to the employee engagement example, if this is done for the whole company, every single person that has responded to the survey should hear about the results and as quickly as possible. So this closes the communication and feedback loop, and also gives people an incentive to take the survey again, because there is a message sent to them that management has heard you, and this is what we've seen, and hopefully this is what we're intending to do. So it also gives a forum for management to explain or clarify what some of the doubts that have been expressed are, and it allows management to either commit to certain actions or to share why certain actions are not possible in the short term and what they are doing in the long run to take a look at addressing. So the other thing that we found to really improve response rates is the speed and relevance at which from which the data is communicated back to the respondents. So for example, if you have a respondent who has responded to an open-ended question like IDGAF, as a manager, as a team manager, you want to be able to quickly clarify this and to let the person know that you've heard them. So platforms like EngageRocket will be able to provide the ability for managers to to anonymously clarify what it is that this person meant. So the respondent is able to reply to the manager in an anonymized environment that will allow the manager to quickly understand what it is exactly that they need to take action on. So by closing this loop very quickly and in an extremely relevant manner, response rates can be a lot higher because the individual employees will have faith that management is indeed listening and thinking about taking action. So we're coming to the end of our time together in the webinar, and here's a small thank you for joining us live. For all of you, thank you so much for staying this far. You're going to be receiving in your inbox a free ebook that we have provided for you. And this summarizes and expands on everything that we covered during this webinar today, all around designing great employee surveys, and you can get a lot more details around some of the best practices in crafting those questions that you're going to be asking. So with that, I'd like to see if there are any questions that have been asked. If there are no questions so far, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And once again, my name is Chitong. I'm from EngageRocket. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.